Okay, thank you all for your patience. We're going to make a start. I'll let the last few people join in on this lovely sunny day, if it's sunny where you are. So today we are covering one of what I call the Rebranding India webinars. You know, we've had our India for Beginners, and we have our destination spotlights, and this is one of our, how to look at India differently as a different destination webinars. So following on from the Adventure webinar. So here we go. Welcome notes as always. It's just me today, so no guest speakers, I'm afraid. So we'll aim to keep the webinar at 35 to 40 minutes. As always, at the end there will be a Q&A session, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. And then any further questions on from that, please do email me. And details will be at the end if you don't have them already. So the purpose of this webinar really is not just to focus on the tiger, it's to look at India's diversity as a whole, wildlife diversity. Most of you online now have listened to some of my webinars, or know me personally, and know that I have a reputation for always looking beyond. My reputation started with looking beyond the Taj Mahal. And this webinar is also going to look beyond the tiger. Now, I am by no means in any way, shape or form disregarding the tiger. It's the national animal of India. It's the most marvelous creature, and to see a tiger on safari is quite an extraordinary experience. But we have so much more wildlife in India, as well as the tiger. And I think encouraging people to look at India's wildlife as a whole would truly enhance their wildlife experience. People who go there just to focus on tiger, it's the sole purpose of their safari, and if they don't see tiger, they're very disappointed. And this became quite a big problem in wildlife trips to India. Notice I call them wildlife trips and not tiger safaris. And I think if people appreciate how much more there is to India's wildlife as a whole and appreciate how much more they can see, it would also encourage more people to use India as a wildlife destination. So we will be focusing on the tiger. There are people who do want to see a tiger as part of their trip to India, so we will be looking at that and some of the best parks to do that. As I mentioned, we'll look at the diversity of India, its topography, and the wildlife beyond the tiger. The different types of safari experiences that we have on offer, the different kind of wildlife lodges, the quality of the naturalists and how these can really enhance a client's experience, and then just looking at some regions and helping you plan some wildlife itineraries. So, of course, the tiger, it is magnificent. India has the highest population of tigers in the wild of anywhere in the world. I do believe there's some crazy statistic of domesticated tigers in America. And to see a tiger in India is truly an extraordinary experience. I think what is important to point out is that, they're not sort of zoo animals. When you go on safari, it takes time and patience to look for a tiger. It takes time and patience to see a tiger. I don't know how many of you out there follow sort of quite a lot of the naturalists. I certainly do on Facebook, and you'd almost think, with the fantastic photographs that they manage to take, that tigers are two a penny. They're not. I would say on any safari in India, depending on the park, but the key parks that people go to see tiger, I would say that on average, if you do a 3-night stay, then your chances are pretty good, but it's never ever guaranteed. And that's one thing that I really want to get across. I mean, I really hope at the end of this webinar that you're all you'll look at India differently and India's wildlife differently and see that I really truly believe that we can compare with Africa. But people go to Africa and they're quite accepting of the fact that they might not see the big five, whereas people tend to come to India and just want to focus on seeing the tiger and get very upset if they don't see it. So it is a fantastic experience. I think on a 3-night stay in any park, you would see tiger. You can't take away from that, from it being the highlight of a client safari. And so we're going to look at some of the parks here that are pretty good for tiger sightings. Now, anybody who just wants the chance of seeing a tiger within a normal itinerary and they've not been to India before, then it stands to reason Tarjan Tigers is your itinerary. You know, Delhi, Agra, Ranthambhore, Jaipur. Most people would kind of rush people into Ranthambhore, just give them 2 nights there and send them out again. And if people would kind of quite like to see tiger, but, you know, are not that bothered, then that's a perfect way to do it. People would like slightly more chance then to give them an extra night. If people have been to India before, or people are more focused on seeing tiger, then the parks of Madhya Pradesh are definitely the ones to go for. Bandhavgarh, being one of the smallest parks but with a higher population of tiger, has become very popular over the years as being one of the key places for people to see tiger. Kanha, as anyone who knows me will know, that place has a very special place in my heart, having spent a year there, or a season there. And Pench. And so Kanha, Bandhavgarh, Pench are the 3 main parks that everybody knows throughout the range in Madhya Pradesh for, you know, the 3 most popular parks for tiger safari. And what I would say is, you know, combining those parks, because each is different, each is a different kind of forest, and each has different chances of seeing different animals over and above the tiger as well. 2, shall we say, late comers to the party pretty much were Panna and Satpura. Satpura opened its first decent lodge around 10 years ago now. Panna a little more recently. But again, stunningly beautiful parks. And if you want your clients to go to a park and have a decent chance of seeing tiger, but other amazing wildlife, but being in parks that aren't overrun and really, really busy, then those 2 are definitely well worth considering as well. Tadoba has come into its own recently in Maharashtra, and that's become quite a popular park and also has a good reputation for tigers. Corbett was always the park where you didn't see tiger, you know, back 15, 16 years ago when I was still in London and selling holidays. I have to say that, you know, living in Delhi, Corbett was quite an easy park to get to. It's extraordinarily beautiful, and I think wildlife safaris have come on in leaps and bounds now. I think you have lodges that are managed by people who are really keen on tigers and conservation, and also the quality of naturalists has come on in leaps and bounds. You know, there is a section on my blog on the young naturalists of India, because, you know, these guys are coming up, they're passionate about, and they get to know the habitats and the behaviours of the tiger. So I do think that this makes, you know, parks that previously people may have considered not the best for viewing tigers and wildlife, it's opened them up a lot more, and it's enabled people to learn more about the behaviour and the habitats and which areas of the park you're likely to see them. And I know one day I saw 2 sub-adult males in Corbett, and I called a friend of mine to say, I've just seen 2 tigers in Corbett, and he said, let me guess, you're at Bridge Drying Zone, it was 2 sub-adult males, and this is where you saw them. You know, all I'd said was I was in, you know, Corbett. So, you know, and I'm going to come on to the quality of naturalists later on, but I think these slightly less well-known parks, the parks that were slightly not considered sort of 10, 15 years ago, are now also really coming into their own. Umred became very popular. It had the largest tiger in India. And then down south, I think tiger sightings down south are less possible, shall we say, than in the north. But if people are travelling down through the south, then it's definitely worth considering if they do want a wildlife experience. Then Kabini, Nagholi and Bandipur are definitely worth considering. Periyar, I believe, has become sort of over touristy and overrun, but if you do treks into the forest and go bamboo rafting, then there's a good chance of seeing some really good wildlife there as well. But I think if you just think about the sheer diversity of India, okay, we've got mountains, we've got desert, we've got mangroves, we've got, you know, forests, we've got subtropical forests, and it just lends itself to a whole variety of different wildlife, okay? And this is where I think India really comes into its own. Now, I purposely use this slide for it to look very different from all the other slides. And that's because it's just one of my favourite wildlife facts, and I always get excited about it, maybe rather bizarrely. But there are in India 15 species of wild cat. Okay, so that's 14 plus the tiger. Okay, I do believe that's 7 more, or is it 8 more species of wild cat than they have in Africa. Okay. So some of them are the bigger cats that we've come to know. You know, your leopard, snow leopard safaris have become really popular of late, if people don't mind the cold. I haven't quite ventured up there yet. You know, we have the Asiatic lion, we have clouded leopard, and then we have all these smaller species of cat as well. I've been really lucky to work together with quite a few really keen, excellent wildlifers. And actually the number of people who are looking for these different cat species now is really increasing. You know, we also have bear. You know, who thinks of India for bear? I mean, everyone knows about the sloth bear, but we have the Himalayan black bear, we have the brown bear, and also, you know, the sun bear. So different species. I mean, I planned a trip for this year, whether it's going to come off or not, but to go in search of the Himalayan brown bear and also wolves up in the dark. So there's lots of variety of species. I think that's 50% of the world's species of bear that we actually have in India. Birding. So Abhishek, you've raised your hand, but can I answer your question at the end? Birding, there are around about 1,300 species of birds in India. So again, migratory birds. A couple of people raising their hands, hang on a second. Can you, Bob, a question? Okay, I can't see any questions. Can I answer questions at the end? Unless can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Yeah, there are over 1,300 species or around 1,300 species of bird in India. Okay, perfect, thank you. So, and again, you know, the species of birds vary from region to region, from state to state, and from season to season. You know, we have migratory birds, we have Himalayan birds. You know, so again, it's a fantastic birders destination. I think anybody who was listening to the talk on Gujarat that we had, was it last week or the week before, that said, you know, that some people actually come out specifically for birding itineraries on 21-day birding itineraries. Other people just start to learn birds, you know, as they're going around on safari. I know, you know, when I spent my 8 months in Kanha, you know, I could possibly name a peacock when I got there, but it's surprising how addictive getting into birding can be. Another thing I wanted to mention about India and its wildlife experiences is the variety of safaris that there are available. You know, I think people don't think of India as having expanses, and we don't have the vast expanses that they have in Africa, but we do have wonderful, 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 beautiful parks, and we do offer a variety of experiences. Of course, the most common, the most popular type of experience will be the Jeep Safari. You know, lodges quite often will have their own Jeeps, or the park will have their own Jeeps. They can be shared Jeep safaris or private Jeep safaris, depending. Then there's the canter. Now, the canters have become popular in parks that were popular, shall we say, in a way, a necessary evil. So in areas where the parks were more accessible, they had to bring zoning in, and they had to try and restrict the numbers of vehicles that they had in the parks. And so for that, you know, reason, you tend to have, particularly in Ranthambhore, canter vehicles like this that can seat 20 people. People can also get Jeep safaris, but the numbers are limited. So, you know, they really do ideally need to be booked in advance. Does being in a canter detract from the wildlife experience? I think for really keen wildlifers it can do, because if you're there and you're wanting to take photographs and you're wanting to sit and wait, then a private Jeep is better. But the canters do go into some of the main areas of, for example, Ranthambhore National Park. So in terms of chances of sighting, and you know, the animals there have, you know, fortunately or unfortunately got used to vehicles, then you do still have, you know, good chances of sighting wildlife in the parks in a canter vehicle, although, you know, for me a Jeep would always be preferable. But there are also other types of safari available as well. Now, not all these are available in all parks, okay? Some of them are park specific. But, you know, in, for example, Satpura National Park, they do some really wonderful buffer zone treks and camping. So you can camp out in the buffer zone. Walking safaris are possible in a couple of the parks, where you go out with a guide and you can actually walk through some of the core and buffer areas. Some really fun cycling trips are coming up now, particularly in Madhya Pradesh, where you can cycle between the lodges. Some of the journey might be in a jeep, some on by bike, depending on how fit and adventurous you are feeling. There is always a backup vehicle. So there's lots of opportunities for getting out and getting sort of closer to nature, slowing it down a bit, or also being active while on safari. And again, there are a couple of parks where boating safaris are also possible. So the left photograph here was one that I took when in Satpura National Park around 10 years ago. And they also do sort of lovely evening boat rides out from Pana on the Ken River. So boating safaris in certain parks are also possible. Moving on, my slides are jumping as always. I think one thing that's really nice and that's coming up now are the junior ranger programs. So quite a few of the lodges are coming up with these junior ranger programs to try and encourage and engage younger people in safaris. These can be either specifically tailored to your own children. We can work sort of directly with the lodge to see if they would do that for you. And depending on numbers of clients at the time and numbers of naturalists available, then that can be arranged. But there are also set weeks when, you know, you can go with your children and other children can be there, and they can go off with a naturalist and you know, over the course of 3, 4 or 5 days, they get to learn a bit about the jungle, the nature, the insects and the wildlife and tracking and things like that. So they're really wonderful introductions into wildlife for the younger generation. These are very much lodge specific. It's certain lodges that do them. So we can, if anybody would be interested in those junior ranger programs, then you can let me know and we can share the lodges with you who do those. As always, again, I think you know me by now, it's really important to work with and engage local communities when travelling with India. I mentioned a report done by Raghu Chandawat last year, where he'd been and surveyed, you know, parks throughout India, and there was a definite correlation between parks where better conservation practices were happening, and it's where the locals are engaged and they feel that they also benefit from tiger tourism. And I think particularly, you know, around a lot of the parks in India, these people were actually moved out of their homes, you know, from the parks into the buffer zones. So to encourage them and engage them and ensure that they also benefit from tourism to the area, I do think is really important. You know, some of the photos here, the left one is, you know, a village home that we used to visit from one of the lodges, and the top two were a local market that takes place on a Friday afternoon near Kanha National Park. So where possible, you know, we used to encourage clients to go to the tribal market and to see what went on there. And I think it just opened your eyes to a whole other dimension of tourism. And I think if people have got more time to spend and are interested in offbeat India, rural India, and discovering more about the people and the ecology as well as and conservation, as well as the tiger, then it's really a good thing to do, is to incorporate rural experiences. Also community and conservation. Quite a lot of the lodges that are operating are run by keen people in terms of conservation. They work together with these local communities and also very keen on conservation. And for me, you know, working together with these lodges and finding out about these projects that you can possibly go and volunteer at as well is quite an important part of wildlife tourism in India. I think, you know, one of the biggest challenges that wildlife faces in India is the man-animal conflict. You know, you have a 1.3 billion population. We have national parks where, you know, in some cases, and I don't want to say that tigers are out of danger, they are still an endangered species, but, you know, in some cases, the tiger populations have increased, but the parks aren't big enough. And then you've got the local population surrounding them. So it's working together with people who understand this man-animal conflict and trying to, find solutions to this situation. And there are some great community and conservation projects around as well. Moving on. So when planning a tiger safari, I just said it, oh my word. When planning a wildlife safari, there are key questions to ask to make sure that you really sort of nail it for your clients. One is, what other species would they be interested in seeing? Okay, apart from tiger. Now, a lot of them are just going to say tiger, okay, but quite a few people are quite keen on seeing elephants in the wild as well. Now, if you think about that, then understanding that there aren't any wild elephants in central India, for example. So if seeing wild elephants was key to your client experience as well as the tiger, then that narrows it down in terms of the numbers of parks that you can use. So that's just one small example. Again, if they're really keen on seeing leopard, there's certain places to go to. Snow leopard, a very obvious one. But also the duration of stay. And I think, again, I think I say this in every webinar, it's a case of slowing it down. And I think if people are really keen on safaris, then do slow it down. When I was working in Kanha, I used to get people and they'd had itineraries planned for them. And it was, 2 nights in Bandhavgarh, 2 nights in Kanha, 2 nights in Pench. You have to bear in mind that it's a good sort of 5-6 hour drive between each of these parks. For example, the roads in Madhya Pradesh aren't that good. When people get there, they're then going to be rattled around in the back of the Jeep on safari for several hours, okay? So just give them some time, give them some breathing space. You're also up incredibly early on a morning to go on safari. So, giving people time, giving people at least 3 nights in each park, even if that means cutting it down to just 2 parks, but giving them longer time to spend in each of those parks. Then they get to know it, they get to know the areas, they get to know the naturalists get to know them, and it just overall enhances the entire safari experience. Would people like an accompanying naturalist, yes or no? This is a really interesting point. I learned an awful lot by working really closely together with a fabulous naturalist in India for 2 years. And I very much came from, and this also links in with the type of accommodation, I'd very much come from a luxury travel background where my clients wanted to go on safari, they did want to go and see tiger. For me, it was the lodge that was key, which is the most fabulous lodge, which is the nicest lodge, which is the lodge closest to the ones that they're going to have stayed at in Africa, for example. And it was all about the quality and the luxuriousness of the lodge. And then I worked with this guy who, is a serious wildlifer. And for him and his clients, it wasn't the quality of the lodge, it was the quality of the naturalist, okay? So if you've got people out on a specific mission to see certain wildlife or certain birds or something like that, they're not that bothered about what the accommodation is like. They're prepared to rough it as long as they get to see their key species. So it's kind of 2 very different kinds of wildlife traveller. But I think what has become really apparent to me in both of those scenarios is the naturalist, the naturalist that is available. They really can make or break a wildlife itinerary for a client. Now, I mentioned, some of the young naturalists that are coming up now, and there are some superb young naturalists coming through who are passionate about wildlife. But, a naturalist is so much more. They entertain you. They can tell you about the stars at night. You get some of the most incredible stars at night in the jungle. They have to be a mechanic to be able to fix the Jeep in case it breaks down. They have to know about conservation. They have to know how to host. A naturalist is just one of the key people on any wildlife safari at all. Now, some people will want an accompanying naturalist. And particularly for some of the remote areas that you're going to, then I would highly recommend that. Otherwise, there are some of the really good lodges now who really see the value, say the ones that I talked about in conservation and wildlife, and they employ really, really good naturalists as well. So it's a key factor as to whether a client wants just a chance of seeing tiger, a really good wildlife experience, or if they're really super keen on being very species specific, then travel with an accompanying naturalist. Now we're just going to go through a few of the different regions and the parks that there are there. And again, this is where, you know, this webinar can link in with other webinars, for example. So this is a great example. So Uttarakhand has parks at Rajaji, Corbett, Binsa, and Nanda Devi. Now, Corbett, for example, ties in really nicely with where am I thinking of? Rishikesh, that one. So, you know, quite a lot of people who've, you know, possibly been to India before or are more outdoorsy, you know, would love to combine somewhere like Corbett and go on safari with going to Rishikesh and maybe going whitewater rafting and trekking. So these are, you know, the different kinds of, and this is why we're looking at some of the less popular areas in terms of traditional wildlife safaris and, you know, just tiger safaris. It's getting, you know, people out there a little bit more. You know, I've been up to Missouri, and just above Missouri, for example, there's a tiny private nature reserve called Jabbercat. Again, a fabulous experience to go trekking in and to looking for nature. So it doesn't have to be just the key areas. If people want to get out into nature, then if you're selling safaris or holidays to other regions, then national parks and can be incorporated. And again, you know, these parks in Uttarakhand are where you can find, you know, tiger as well. Uttar Pradesh, I like throwing this one in because it's controversial, just because, you know, people sort of disregard UP in many ways. You know, it's such an unknown state, and it makes me laugh. You know, everybody's heard of Rajasthan, everyone's heard of Kerala, everyone has heard of Goa. So few people have heard of UP, but they will have heard of Varanasi, or they will have heard of Agra, but they don't know about UP. And again, you know, in Uttar Pradesh, you know, if people are doing that sort of Agra, Lucknow, Varanasi circuit, then you have, you know, Dudhwa National Park, which ties in quite nicely. And Dudhwa National Park is actually part of three, you know, there are three national parks there. So you've got Kishanpur, Dudhwa, and Katania Ghat. Now, Katania Ghat is very much wetlands. Okay, so where you go there and go on boat safari for dolphins and crocodile, gharial, things like that. Then Dudhwa and Kishanpur are, you know, for your main wildlife. And so in a stay up there, you can visit all three different parks. And also at Dudhwa, they have one-horned rhino as well. So it's another good place if people did want to see rhino to go to. Gujarat, we mentioned in the Gujarat itinerary. I'd just come back from an incredible safari in Gujarat. It wasn't meant to be. I was meant to focus on seeing wolf. I did, you know, one safari in Belvedere National Park, and we saw wolf, we saw hyena, we saw black buck, we saw jungle cat. It really was quite a phenomenal safari. I then went into Gir. I think people think Gir Asiatic lion, you know, unless people are really keen on seeing the Asiatic lion, they disregard it. But, you know, we saw a lion on a kill. We had a fantastic leopard sighting and fantastic birding as well. Little Ron of Kutch, we saw, you know, desert fox. We saw the wild ass. So again, I think, you know, Gujarat is a place that is quite often overlooked and not considered as a wildlife destination, but as my own experience in February, March shown, then, you know, it really is a fantastic destination for people wanting to go on wildlife as well as culture. Moving on, if my slides will move on, just a picture of some of the wildlife that we saw on safari. You know, so sort of 4 or 5 of those images were ones we actually took on safari in February. Now, Rajasthan, everyone thinks about Ranthambhore. Sariska isn't on here. Sariska's just got a couple of new nice lodges and is starting to come up into itself. And Ranthambhore is the obvious choice. But there's an awful lot of wildlife in and around Rajasthan. So I escorted a journalist a couple of years ago. It wasn't a wildlife itinerary, but we ended up coming across some incredible wildlife. Jawai has really come into its own in the last sort of 5-6 years. You know, it's leopard population there. It's not technically a national park, but the leopard population there and the rika that, you know, they live in harmony with is quite extraordinary, and really good leopard sightings. Also amazing for eagle, owl, mongoose, and lots of smaller wildlife. In and around Jodhpur, you have the nilgai, you have the black buck, and various other deer species. You've got the desert fox and the Desert National Park for the great Indian bustard. So throughout Rajasthan, as I say, that the journey I did. Oh, and now, sorry, I should have mentioned it on here. Just outside of Udaipur, there's a wonderful new hotel that's opened up that have rescued sort of 40 square kilometres or whatever of national park, of barren land, and repopulated it, rewilded it. And the wildlife has come back there. So there's a fantastic private nature reserve just outside of Udaipur that you can go and visit. I went there, spent a couple of nights there last November, just when they were starting to open up, and had amazing wild boar and leopard sightings. So, and you can also do night drives there because it's a private reserve, so you're not stuck to park regulations. So a general journey through Rajasthan in terms of birding and wildlife, you can't really avoid it. Madhya Pradesh, of course, the famous one. So I mentioned, Penj, Kanha, Bandhavgarh, which are the main parks there, but also not to be disregarded by any stretch of the imagination are Panna and Satpura. Panna, very close to Khajuraho, so if people want, I would recommend going and spending sort of 3 or 4 nights at somewhere like Sarai Toria, visiting Khajuraho from there, and then also doing some wildlife experiences. And Satpura didn't really get known terribly well as a tiger destination, although the tiger sightings are improving. But in terms of bear, sloth bear, and leopard, it really has a fantastic reputation for those sightings. And then, the last webinar, wasn't it, was on the northeast. And we mentioned, the one park that everybody knows about is Kaziranga. I have to say, when I went to Kaziranga, it blew me away. Again, it was the naturalist who made it. He pointed out so much stuff to me that I would have missed. But it's an extraordinarily beautiful park. It's got the one-horned rhino. We saw elephant. We saw very fresh tiger pug marks. We didn't quite see the tiger. We saw we saw birds. Sort of eagles. The variety of wildlife there and the overall wildlife experience really was superb. But again, all thanks to my naturalist from Diffley River Lodge. But again, lots of other parks, and this is where your sort of really keen wildlifers who are very species specific would like to go and visit. One place I've still to get to is the Gibbon Wildlife Sanctuary to see the Hulot gibbon. So again, amazing wildlife up in Assam, and I think with the northeast opening up, or it was just before the present crisis, there's an awful lot to see and do there, and incorporating some of the wildlife is a really fun part of visiting that region. Now, the lodges, I mentioned that if you've got really, really super keen wildlifers who are very, very species specific, as my wildlife friend pointed out to me, they're really not that bothered about where they stay. But I think most of us have clients who are a little bit more fussy, shall we say, a little bit more choosy, and do want a luxury lodge to stay in as well. I now think we have lodges to rival Africa. I mean, I very fondly remember the very first lodge I stayed at in Bandhavgarh back in 1999, and it was hilarious. I mean, there was an oval sink that was kind of rammed sort of completely into a hole that it wasn't made for, and it was just sort of hilarious. But now we have extraordinary wildlife lodges. So whatever the park, and again, most of these lodges are run by people who are really keen in tiger conservation, with eco practices. They've got the service levels right, and it just really highlights and makes a wonderful, wonderful wildlife stay for your clients. So, if you want any help in planning itineraries and you do want to know where any of these fabulous lodges are, if that's the kind of accommodation that your client's looking for, whether they're doing lovely bush dinners or whether they're doing picnics out or a private, deck here overlooking the river, there's some really wonderful accommodation choices. And I think this is the classic accommodation image from Penj National Park, Jamtara. There are various things to remember when it comes to safaris in India. It's not always straightforward, it's not always simple, okay? All the parks in India are individually state-run, and so they have their own rules and regulations, and those can vary from season to season, okay, depending on the forest department. So it's always best to check with your local DMC, with, if you work directly with lodges or whoever you work with your DMC, do double check about what the regulations are. You know, that will really, really affect the overall experience. I mean, for example, a few years ago now, you know, they brought zoning in Cannes. Okay, they also made it that you can't do safaris on a Wednesday afternoon. So, you know, if you do happen to have, you know, clients that are rushing through, which I don't recommend, but sort of doing 2 nights, 2 nights, 2 nights, and they land up on a Wednesday and they can't do safaris, they're going to be quite cross. That regulation has been in for some time now. But you never know when these regulations change, so please just never take it for granted. Always at the start of a season, you know, if you're planning wildlife itineraries, or if you're planning, you know, when you get individual inquiries in, just do double check that any regulations haven't changed. Sometimes, you know, they release safaris only from a certain date, but then they do tend to get very booked up. Okay, so it's not to say that if you booked a safari last minute that you couldn't get a safari, but you know, peak season times, weekends in particular, when you have a much higher proportion of domestic tourists, you know, there are now limited numbers of jeeps going into the park, so it is always better to book in advance, or if your client is trying to book last minute, then do just check on availability of safaris. You can have exclusive safaris. It obviously costs quite a bit more. You can, most are shared jeep safaris in most of the parks. And in some parks as well, you know, if you've got those really keen wildlifers, full-day safaris are possible. They are a lot more expensive, but if you've got, you know, the kind of client, the wildlife client who's really focused on that, then in some of the parks, they are possible. So I mentioned that, you know, Madhya Pradesh parks are usually closed, or always closed, or have been in recent years, on a Wednesday afternoon. Maharashtra, I mentioned today, but earlier, that remains closed on a Tuesday. Elephants and elephant safaris now, I have to say no, it's become a big no-no. They still do have mahouts patrolling the parks in central India on their elephants, but elephant shows they haven't been officially banned, but I would definitely not recommend suggesting them for your clients, or recommend doing them for your clients now. And again, we talked about wildlife experiences for children. Planning safaris in South India, again, for example, you know, Kabini, Nagaholi, spectacularly beautiful, but all the safaris there are governed by one central body, so you can't necessarily get a private jeep safari. You don't have a choice of who your clients, you know, go in an 8-seater vehicle or a 20-seater vehicle with. So these are all things worth knowing, because I think, you know, I've always worked on the principle that forewarned is forearmed, and I think as long as the client knows that they're going to have to share a jeep with 7 other people or 6 other people, then they're fine about it. If they get there expecting a private jeep safari, or, you know, they've been told that it will be possible, and it's not, that's when they're going to get grumpy. So do just, you know, make sure, whichever lodge you're using, whichever park that you're using, which are the main, which are the rules and regulations that are applicable for this particular season, and bear in mind they can change. Months for safaris. So most safari parks are closed, national parks are closed between June and October, November. Okay, most of them, a lot of the parks will open around about the 15th of October, some of them stretch it to the 1st of November, but safe to say that most parks are closed during the off-season. There are now some regions in Ranthambhore that are open throughout the monsoon season, you know, throughout the off-season, and also some areas of Corbett National Park, for example, which are open. So it's not to say, if your clients were to travel in that time, which most don't, that they couldn't do a safari, but by and large most parks are closed until October, November. December, January, February, it's really worth noting, and so many agents don't do this, to tell your clients it's going to be really cold. You know, this winter it got down to kind of like 1-2 degrees at night in central India, in Madhya Pradesh. It gets really, really cold, okay? You need lots of layers, you need to wrap up. Okay, your clients need to wrap up. So please tell them, you know, gloves, hats, scarves, layers, okay? Because first thing in the morning, it's going to be freezing cold heading out into the park. As the sun starts to rise and mists start to rise, and you can gradually start, you know, peeling off layers, and it's fine. And by midday when you're back, it's kind of, you know, t-shirt and you know, light trouser weather. But it does get really cold. When it comes to April, May, June, again, I'm just picking the 2 extremes here. April, May, June is fiercely hot wherever you are in India, apart from Ladakh. It's fiercely hot. Okay, most I'm going to say British clients here, wouldn't want to go on wildlife safari at that time of year unless they are mad keen on, you know, wildlife spotting. It is the time when viewings are fantastic. You know, all the grasses have died down, the water, a lot of the water bodies have dried up. It's a brilliant time for sighting, but you've got to bear in mind that it's going to be 40 plus degrees. Okay, so you tend to find it's only really super keen wildlifers who travel to the parks at that time of year. Just thought this might be quite useful. There are various really good guidebooks out there. Toft I wanted to mention. I think a lot of you will be aware of Toft, which is Tour Operators for Tigers, which is a charity that Julia Matthews set up around about 16, 17 years ago now, to really try and bring up the standards of wildlife tourism in India, the standards of the lodges, the quality of conservation and things that go on. So that's his book there that I did just want to mention. But there are some really, really good field guides out there on India, and definitely worth sort of investing in a couple of those depending on what your interest is or your client's interests are. There you go. That was a whiz through India's wildlife. There's an awful lot to cover, but I just wanted to really showcase the diversity that there is out there, the different areas, the different regions, and the different types of opportunities that there are. And a shameless little plug for my book, because as many of you know, I've written a book on Madhya Pradesh. So there we go. So if you do have any questions, more than happy to answer them now. The webinar has been recorded, so if you do want a recording of it, then more than happy to share that with you. And if you can't hang around now for sort of questions and answers, then please do email me either on philippa@indianexperiences.com or info@indianexperiences.com. Thank you very much for your time. We will be back next Wednesday. I'm just drawing up the schedule for the next 2 months worth of webinars. They will be every Wednesday at this time, and we will share that with you via newsletter as soon as we have it confirmed. We're going to be including quite a few of our experienced providers in there. We're also going to be covering Nepal, a region I've just come back from. We're going to have a sort of a fun next series of 8 webinars coming up that will be shared with you. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll catch you next week.